The year is 1944, and on a distant French battlefield, a column of Nazi tanks are making their way to a beleaguered American position. The German Panzer and Tiger tanks are amongst the best the world has ever seen, and heavily protected from the front and sides. American Sherman tanks often see their shells bounce harmlessly off the thick front armor, and have trouble landing damaging strikes against even the side plates. However, from up top, the tanks are incredibly vulnerable. The American outpost the German armored column is moving toward is under heavy attack and on the verge of being overrun. The U.S. troops are attempting a fighting withdrawal, but this new column of tanks and tracked infantry fighting vehicles spells doom for the beleaguered soldiers. Then, suddenly, there's the rapidly growing sound of diving aircraft. Confused, the Americans look up. They've been calling for air support for hours, but there's simply none available in the area. As the diving aircraft grows in size, the men are even more confused. It's an L-4 Grasshopper, a light, unarmed aircraft used exclusively for aerial reconnaissance. The Germans, however, are keenly aware of what this airplane is, and more specifically of the madman who pilots it and what he's able to do. Desperate machine gunners atop the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles fire up at the diving plane, and despite the hail of gunfire, the plane keeps coming. Then, just a few hundred meters from becoming a smoking crater on the ground, there's a rapid series of popping sounds as two bazookas jerry-rigged to the wings of the aircraft fire. The anti-armor rounds hit home on two of the tanks, easily penetrating the thin top armor and knocking them out of commission. As the small Grasshopper pulls up, it begins to bank, ready to make another attack run. It still has 4 more bazookas left to fire. In a panic, the German tanks scatter, giving the Americans the opportunity to withdraw safely. 2 years earlier, 29-year-old high school teacher Charles Carpenter couldn't have been further from a feared combat ace. Mild-mannered and well-educated, Carpenter was well-liked by his community and had a job teaching history at the local high school. However, when war came for the United States in 1942, Charles immediately volunteered for military service. Thanks to his education, Carpenter was commissioned as a second lieutenant after going through boot camp and a shortened version of officer candidate school. Then, due to his intelligence and calm demeanor, Carpenter was chosen to be a pilot, and the ever-eager Carpenter happily accepted. Unfortunately, though, Carpenter was assigned to be a spotter for Army artillery, meaning he would be learning to fly the L-4 Grasshopper in the Stinson L-5 Sentinel. These aircraft were incredibly light and carried no armament, designed to instead be fast, agile, and able to loiter over a battlefield for a long time so as to serve as a spotter for friendly artillery. With an aircraft in the area radioing back firing directions, artillery was many times deadlier than without, and despite being initially disappointed that he wouldn't be flying a fighter, Carpenter accepted his equally important, if less glamorous, job. Disappointment, it seemed, would follow Carpenter, though, as after finishing his flight schooling, Carpenter was stuck training others in the US and left out of the war until getting orders to head for France in 1944. Taking advantage of his many flight hours in the US, though, Carpenter had mastered the handling of both the Grasshopper and the Sentinel, a skill which would come very handy soon. In France, Carpenter was assigned to the 1st Bombardment Division under the command of Major General R.B. Williams. Many he met routinely underestimated Carpenter, who very much gave off the vibe of a calm and collected history teacher, surely someone very out of place from the chaotic battlefields of Western Europe. Then Carpenter got a chance to prove himself in combat when he was assigned temporarily as an artillery liaison to a ground unit. Despite being a pilot, Carpenter was well versed in the techniques for calling in artillery fire, as well as the different types of fire support available to the U.S. Army. His unit responsibility was to move ahead of a friendly line and scout out locations that could be turned into suitable landing strips for friendly aircraft. During the scouting mission, Carpenter's unit stumbled across an understrength unit of infantry pinned down by heavy enemy fire coming from a nearby village. The German soldiers spotted Carpenter's unit approaching and immediately set up a blocking force. The tactical picture was simple and deadly clear to all. If Carpenter's unit didn't break through this blocking force and engage the enemy in the town ahead, the pinned down infantry would be killed to a man. The tank platoon commander in command of the unit's tanks hesitated, however. Their job was to act as scouts and not become decisively engaged, and taking tanks into an enemy-held town without proper infantry support to cover them was very dangerous. That's when Carpenter acted, however, unable to watch the pinned-down infantrymen die from a distance. Much to the shock of the tank's crew, Carpenter rushed to one of the lead tanks and hopped atop the turret, grabbing the butterfly trigger on the .50 caliber machine gun mounted there and letting loose on the enemy ahead of them. Roaring like a madman, Carpenter screamed out, "Let's go!" and the rallying cry immediately set the men in the tanks to action. Surprised by the zealous charge of the tanks, the Germans holding the town beat a hasty retreat. When the fighting stopped, however, Carpenter was arrested by military police on behalf of the tank commander. Carpenter was not even in the unit's chain of command, as he'd been attached temporarily to act as a liaison, and then he had completely usurped that chain of command he wasn't even a part of to boot. Threatened with court-martial, General Patton himself dismissed the charges, proudly exclaiming that Carpenter was exactly the type of man he wanted in his Third Army. It seems, however, that Carpenter's brief stint in ground combat left him with a deep frustration when flying air recon missions overhead in his unarmed aircraft. Watching German tanks and armored troop transports rumble by below and unable to do anything about it was too great a frustration to bear, and Carpenter got an idea. By now, the rumor mill spoke of pilots who had experimented with attaching bazookas to their aircraft and using them to attack tanks from above. Firing a rocket-propelled explosive penetrator, the M1A1 bazooka had an effective range of between 250 and 300 yards. Against the thick front armor of a German tank, the bazooka was useless, and American infantry had to wait to take shots at the sides or ideally the rear of a German tank. A dangerous prospect, it was still better than being completely helpless against these lumbering behemoths. Carpenter immediately attached 2 bazookas to the wings of his Grasshopper, and then rigged an electric switch he could toggle from the cockpit that would fire them. Carpenter's airplane was soon nicknamed Rosie the Rocketeer, and it would be a well-earned name. He soon scored his first kill against a German armored car, diving down from the sky and getting a direct hit with a single bazooka shot. Not long after, Carpenter was hunting for German tanks, and shortly after his first kill on an armored car, he got his first Panzer kill. From the sky, the bazooka could easily penetrate the very thin top armor of even a King Tiger tank, one of the most feared tanks of World War II. To do so, though, Carpenter had to dive down onto his target until he was only 100 meters or so above it, as he had no way of aiming his bazookas and had to ensure an accurate hit. This daredevil maneuver saw him then pulling several G's as he immediately yanked back on the throttle in order to avoid smashing his airplane into the ground below. At first, Carpenter was ignored by German infantry and the vehicles below. The sight of a small artillery spotter plane was a familiar one to the Germans, and opening fire on one was generally a bad idea, as it would give their position away and invite the pilot to call in an artillery strike on them. This let Carpenter earn kill after kill, blasting apart armored cars, tanks, and even groups of infantry with his bazookas. Soon, though, the Germans grew wise to Carpenter, and upon spotting his small plane, would light it up with all the firepower they had. Despite flying into virtual walls of lead, Carpenter refused to give up his attacks, and he continued to rack up enemy kills. His original 2 bazookas grew to 6, and soon other pilots were hearing of his successes and trying the tactic out for themselves. However, the extreme flying maneuvers required and the sheer amount of return fire the pilots faced quickly discouraged many from the suicidal act. Carpenter's greatest deed, though, would come late in 1944, when the Germans launched a blistering counterattack against the 4th Armored Division. Caught completely off guard, the Germans advanced deep enough into the lines of the 4th Armored that they now threatened the unit's battlefield HQ. If they could take the HQ, it would throw the entire division's defense into disarray, leading to the destruction or capture of hundreds of men. Carpenter immediately took to the air, his trusty Grasshopper fitted with 6 bazooka tubes ready to fire. Unfortunately, thick ground fog prevented Carpenter from getting a visual on the fight below, and so he decided to loiter around until the fog cleared up. By noon, the fog had finally lifted enough for Carpenter to see what was going on down below, and that's when he spotted a column of APCs and tanks heading to reinforce the attack on the division's HQ. Carpenter immediately put his plane into a dive and lined up with the 2 leading personnel carriers, taking them out with his bazookas and getting the attention of the Germans below. The Germans broke formation as they tried to evade the aerial attack, buying enough time for the Americans to redeploy to face this new threat. Flying back to rearm twice, Carpenter launched deadly strafing attack after strafing attack on the German unit, allowing the 4th Division's HQ section to successfully retreat. Carpenter would go on to fly his Grasshopper with reckless abandon throughout the war. Thanks to the very light construction and the plane's incredible lift capacity, unless an enemy round managed to hit the cockpit, the fuel tank, or the engine directly, the small plane could take a major beating and keep on flying. Often Carpenter would return back to base with his fuselage and wings full of bullet holes, only to patch them up and to be back up in the skies the next day. Sometimes, though, Carpenter wasn't satisfied playing his part of the war in the skies, and once he strafed a column of German tanks, he then landed on a field next to them, picking up a discarded German rifle and taking 6 of them prisoner. By war's end, Carpenter was known to all as the Mad Major, and though he was only officially credited with 6 tanks destroyed or disabled, his unofficial record was much higher. Carpenter, however, fell seriously ill in 1945, effectively ending his participation in the Second World War. It was discovered that he had Hodgkin's disease, and though doctors only gave him 2 years to live, Carpenter once more defied the odds. He returned back to the States and to his role as a quiet, unassuming high school history teacher, where he would remain until his death in 1966 to cancer. Rarely speaking about his part in the war, Carpenter taught hundreds of young students who no doubt had little clue that they were being taught by one of the bravest and most insane pilots of all time. Think you would have had the guts to be a pilot in World War II? What other historical figure do you want to hear about? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.